When it comes to the interview process, it can be overwhelming to think about all that it entails. The DEI workgroup created worksheets to help you through the whole process. From planning the interviews all the way through the evaluation and selection process, we've got you covered. One challenge that can be hard to avoid in interviews is your own bias. Sometimes you might not even be aware that you have it. Today I'm going to go over 4 main types of bias and later how to avoid it. First, confirmation bias. This is a tendency for people to seek out information that supports a preconceived belief about the applicant that was formed prior to the interview. To put it simply, have you ever convinced yourself a movie was going to be great before you went and saw it? I'm willing to bet it lived up to those expectations. When you convince yourself of something, anything, your brain's more likely to think it meets those expectations. That's confirmation bias. The second type of bias is called affective heuristic. That sounds complicated, but really it just means we tend to make decisions based on quick and superficial evaluations. Attractiveness, race, and gender are all things interviewers subconsciously use if they aren't aware. Now, none of those things have anything to do with who the best candidate is. You know that. But without being aware that this kind of bias exists, it can leak into your decision making. So make it a point to intentionally focus on the real qualifications, not the superficial ones. The third bias is called anchoring. This is a tendency for interviewers to place an arbitrary anchor of expectation on a candidate. This, in turn, influences the evaluation process. This means that when you place a higher level of expectation on someone before the interview, they're more likely to be evaluated favorably. Of course, the opposite is true as well. You can probably see how anchoring and confirmation bias can work together to affect your decision-making process. This is why going into interviews with an open mind is such a crucial part of the process. The fourth type of bias is called intuition. This is a less structured bias, but it's important to know that intuition plays a big role in the evaluation process. This is because an interview will never reveal everything you need to know about a candidate. The issue here is that intuition by itself isn't reliable. Candidates are always going to give you the most favorable view of their skill set. Plus, as an interviewer, you're never going to be able to ask about every little thing. This is why asking fair and equitable questions and using that in the evaluation process is so critical. Now that we've covered the types of bias you'll most likely encounter, let's get into how to avoid them. After all, knowing about the bias is half the battle. Avoiding them is much more difficult. It's also more important. To avoid bias, here's 8 things you can do. First, have multiple people involved in the selection process. This will help to cancel out one person's bias. Try to make sure the people involved in this process bring a diversity of perspectives to the table. Second, avoid coded language like someone who's a good fit. This is one way we subconsciously look to confirm what we already believe. Instead, know the skills needed for the position and know which candidates have them. Third, make it a point to avoid commenting on the appearance or demeanor of the people you interview. Remember affective heuristic? Avoid it by not letting yourself consider those superficial factors. Fourth, be specific in what you're looking for. The more specific you can be with the position requirements, the easier it is to find the most qualified candidate. Fifth, sleep on it. This is an old saying that gets beat into the ground, but that's because it's good advice. Don't make a decision right away. Take a day to let everything sink in. This is proven to cut down on gender bias specifically. Sixth, have a structured criteria. If you can develop a rubric to score candidates, even better. The more you make the process standardized based on qualifications, the less room bias has to creep in. Plus, there's probably already a rubric out there you could use or easily adapt, so the work might already be done for you. Seventh, make sure each evaluator understands what you're looking for and how to score the interviews. Do they understand the rubric? Do they know what the position demands? The more you plan, the better your results will be. Eighth, hold the evaluators accountable. By using the rubrics and taking notes based on qualifications, things like gender bias and racial bias will be less likely to play a role. Evaluators should also be putting their name on the rubrics to make the process even more transparent. When it comes to avoiding bias and interviewing in general, there is so much more to consider. That's why the DEI workgroup has a whole website with references for you to look at and learn from. This video is just the tip of the iceberg to get you started. Remember, be aware that bias exists, make a plan to reduce it, and focus on giving everyone an equitable and fair chance.